No audio? No audio? Louis and Dauphine Marie-Joseph. He enjoyed luxury beyond imagination. His grandfather, King Louis XV, even created the title Count of Artois just for him. However, as the youngest son of the heir to the throne, it seemed highly unlikely that he would ever get the crown. But fate was already working in his favor. In 1761, a terrible family tragedy brought Charles one step closer to the throne. His eldest brother, the Duke of Burgundy, passed from a sudden illness at the age of 9. Then, not even 5 years later, his father also passed on, making Charles second in line for the throne, after his next oldest brother, Louis Auguste. But fate wasn't finished with Charles' family just yet. Charles' mother, Marie-Joseph, took the loss of her husband and eldest son particularly hard, and never truly recovered. In a cruel and ironic twist, she wouldn't have to suffer long. In 1767, she succumbed to tuberculosis, making Charles and his 4 surviving siblings orphans. Suddenly, the survival of the Bourbon family line was in doubt. In an effort to shore up his family's lineage and power, Charles performed his first royal duty at the age of 16, when he married Marie-Thérèse of Savoy. But she wasn't exactly a catch. Charles's contemporaries described his new wife as diminutive, somewhat ill-shaped, clumsy, and with a long nose. It's also not like she was a great conversationalist either. Criticism of Charles' new wife continued without mercy. While Marie's contemporaries conceded that she had a nice complexion and was good-hearted, that's about where the compliments ended. After visiting France shortly after the marriage, the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, called Marie a complete idiot. Clearly, the couple was horribly mismatched. Charles had an insatiable appetite for romance, and, according to the Count of Hassek, few beauties were cruel to him. Among his many conquests was the opera singer, ballerina, and lady of the town, Anne Victoire d'Herviers. But his greatest love was Louise de Polastron, an affair that sparked even greater scandal. Despite preferring his mistresses, Charles still managed to perform his dynastic duty. In 1775, his wife gave birth to their first son, Louis-Antoine, Duc d'Angoulême, the first legitimate Bourbon of the next generation. 3 years later, his second son, Charles Ferdinand, Duc de Berry, was born. Not everyone in his family proved so prolific. Thanks to his lavish spending and open affairs, Charles had developed a reputation as King Louis XVI's reckless younger brother. But for one, he wasn't the one being marked, since neither King Louis XV nor the Count of Provence had fathered children yet. Pamphleteers in Paris had a field day speculating about the king's supposed impotence. Pretty soon, however, he reclaimed the title of the family's black sheep. On Mardi Gras 1778, the glittering court of Versailles gathered for the masked ball. Charles, of course, attended in disguise along with a new mistress, believing that their masks would hide their true identities. But one keen-eyed observer recognized him immediately, the Duchess of Bourbon, Bathilde d'Orléans. Worse yet, she recognized the woman he was with. Despite the elaborate disguises of the Mardi Gras masked ball, the Duchess of Bourbon recognized his companion for the evening, Anne-Michelle Dorothée. Not only was she a lady-in-waiting to Charles's sister, Princess Elizabeth, but she also happened to be married. A serious scandal was brewing. Charles's carefree night at the Royal Opera of Versailles took a turn for the worse when he and Anne realized that the Duchess of Bourbon was watching them. The Duchess, no stranger to court scandals, was already piecing the affair together. To avoid an intimate confrontation, Charles and Anne separated into the crowd, but the damage was done. If Charles had thought the Duchess of Bourbon would simply let his little affair go, he was gravely mistaken. Anne had once been the Duchess's lady-in-waiting, but after capturing her husband's affections, the Duchess threw her out of the household. To see her again, arm in arm with the king's brother no less, was a deliberate insult. Charles still believed that his disguise would keep him safe from scandal, but the Duchess of Bourbon had other plans. As he took a seat to recover from the night's tension, she sat beside him and hatched her plan. After a few courteous words, the Duchess lunged for his mask, ripping away his false beard. The jig was up, but the madness was only beginning. Charles could not believe the Duchess' brash move and breach of etiquette. Enraged by her public stunt, he grabbed her mask in return and crushed it against her face with such force that she burst into tears. Then, without a single word, he rose from his seat, turned his back on her, and left her humiliated in front of the entire Versailles elite. But if Charles thought he'd heard the last of this, he was very wrong. The scandal didn't end when Charles walked away. It got worse. The next evening, the Duchess of Bourbon hosted a lavish dinner and proceeded to tell her guests what had transpired. Adding a few lies and embellishments, she painted herself as the victim of an unprovoked attack, whipping her guests into a fit of righteous indignation. By the end of the night, the French aristocracy demanded revenge. The court's thirst for justice soon spiraled out of control. The public demanded that Charles and the Duke of Bourbon, the Duchess' husband, settle their grievance with a duel. Marie Antoinette, wanting to defend her friend and brother-in-law, intervened as an intermediary. Together with Baron de Besenval, they came up with a genius idea: give the people what they want. Instead of a real duel, however, they agreed to stage one, and Charles, ever the amateur actor, was happy to oblige. On the arranged day, Charles and the Duke coincidentally crossed paths at the Bois de Boulogne. The duel was set to begin. Charles and the Duke drew their swords in preparation for their duel, but their gentle jests were the sharpest blades they'd cross. The fight lacked the intensity of a real duel, and both men knew it. They fenced for appearance's sake, careful to ensure neither left with anything more than a scratch. Charles had been content with his unserious, frivolous lifestyle until the monarchy faced financial ruin in 1786. France was drowning in debt from its overseas commitments, and the government needed drastic reforms. Charles supported taxing the aristocracy, but he refused to surrender the privileges of the nobility and the church. In his own words, it was time for repair, not demolition. In 1789, as the monarchy's, and by extension Charles' financial crisis deepened, hoping to push through much-needed reforms, King Louis XVI convened the Estates General. But Charles, ever the hardline conservative, opposed the Third Estate's demands for greater power. Even his brother accused him of being more of a royalist than the king himself. His hardline ultra-royalist ambitions would bring ruin to his household. Charles, still wanting his way, conspired against his brother to oust the liberal finance minister Jacques Necker. But Charles, impatient as ever, pulled the trigger on his scheme too early, forcing Necker's dismissal on July 11, 1789. His timing couldn't have been worse. In light of Necker's firing, the people revolted, culminating in the storming of the Bastille. He had unwittingly sparked a revolution, and not for the last time. As the French Revolution unfolded, in no small part due to Charles' actions, Charles fled Paris with his family and a handful of close courtiers. While many believe that he was fleeing in cowardice, modern historians suggest that Louis XVI had secretly approved of his brother's escape, fearing the monarchy's future was already in jeopardy. He was definitely right about that part. With France no longer safe, Charles and his family sought refuge in Savoy, his wife's homeland. There, they reunited with members of the Condé family, another branch of the Bourbon dynasty. But exile was not to be a single destination. Charles soon moved on to Turin, then eventually to Trier, Germany, under his uncle's protection. By 1791, Charles was on the move again, but this time he left without his wife. As per his instructions, Marie-Thérèse remained behind in Savoy, marking the beginning of their permanent separation. In fact, Charles refused to see her again, even forbidding her from attending their son's wedding. When she passed on in 1805, they had spent more than a decade apart, never reconciling. He had only room for one thing in his heart: his family's lost throne. Charles wasted no time plotting to restore the monarchy. He gathered royalist forces for an invasion of France, but Marie Antoinette pleaded for a delay, fearing for her family's safety as they were trapped in Paris. Sadly, by the time he was ready to mobilize again, it would be too late. As Charles plotted from exile, his brother and sister-in-law rotted away in a cell. By the time he had assembled an army, it was too late. The revolutionary forces had abolished the monarchy. From across the border, Charles could do nothing as the mobs dragged Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to the guillotine. When revolutionary France descended into chaos, Charles fled yet again, this time finding safe refuge in Great Britain. Luckily for him, King George III rolled out the royal carpet, even providing him with a lavish allowance. Bouncing between Edinburgh and London, Charles settled down with his longtime mistress, Louise de Polastron. However, Great Britain was never home for Charles. In January 1814, after more than 2 decades in exile, Charles saw his chance to reclaim his throne. Slipping away from London in secret, he raced to join the coalition forces in southern France as they closed in on Napoleon. With his older brother Louis XVI failing to lead, Charles took charge, holding a royal decree that named him Lieutenant General of France. By April, Napoleon abdicated, paving the way for Charles' return. As Lieutenant General, Charles wasted no time shaping the new France in his own image. While the newly crowned King Louis XVI was still in England, Charles covertly established an ultra-royalist secret service, operating without the king's knowledge. This network of informants spied on political opponents and crushed dissent, surviving for 5 years in the shadows. That wasn't the only way he undermined his brother's rule. By 1824, Charles' elder brother, King Louis XVI, was rotting alive. Quite literally, the king had dry and wet gangrene spreading through his legs and spine. Then, on September 16, 1824, the inevitable finally happened. Louis XVI succumbed, and Charles, at 66 years of age, at last took the throne. The only question was, how long could he keep it? Charles knew he was ruling a fractured France. Some longed for the ancient regime, while others wanted the monarchy gone. His coronation was designed to be a compromise, blending old royal traditions with the new political reality. Even the celebrated writer Chateaubriand praised him, calling Charles affable like Louis XIV and frank as Henry IV. But not everyone was quite so convinced. At first, Charles seemed to embrace liberal reforms, doing away with press censorship and touring northern and eastern France to connect with the people. But behind the scenes, he installed ultra-royalists such as Joseph de Villèle throughout his government, making it clear where his true loyalties lay. His next moves left no doubt what he truly wanted. Charles believed his July ordinances would quell dissent. Instead, they ignited a rebellion again. On July 26, 1830, outraged journalists gathered at Le National to denounce the king. The next morning, the monarchist's mouthpiece, Le Moniteur Universel, published the ordinances. Journalists responded with a call to arms of their own. Obedience ceases to be a duty. Charles once again had a revolt on his hands. As Paris exploded into unrest, Charles's government panicked. Crowds flooded with chants of "Down with the Bourbons" and "Long live the Charter." Instead of ceding ground, however, Charles doubled down and ordered a crackdown on the protesters. What ensued was riots, looting, and clashes between authorities and the people. Desperate to stop the revolution, a delegation of deputies begged Charles to revoke his controversial ordinances. However, Charles refused to back down from his untenable position, but by late July, it no longer mattered. The Chamber of Deputies declared his distant cousin, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, the new king, plastering posters of their decision across Paris. By day's end, Charles X had lost everything. By August of 1830, Charles simply acknowledged the inevitable. His rule had come to an end. He abdicated, signing a declaration that forced his own son, the Dauphin, to abdicate as well in favor of his grandson, Henri, Duc de Bordeaux. However, the plan nearly collapsed when the Dauphin refused to sign away his rights. According to contemporary reports, father and son engaged in a furious shouting match behind closed doors. But, after several minutes, Charles convinced his son to sign the declaration. Despite Charles' desperate maneuver, Louis-Philippe had no intention of recognizing the young Duc de Bordeaux as king. Instead, on August 9, 1830, the Chamber of Deputies officially crowned Louis-Philippe as King of the French. With that, the Bourbon monarchy was finished, and Charles was left as a king without a kingdom. Stripped of power, Charles and his family fled as an angry mob of 14,000 closed in. They managed to escape to Britain on steamships using fake names, but their humiliation was far from over. When they arrived, the British greeted them coldly, mockingly waving tricolor flags, the flag of the liberal movement, in their faces as they disembarked. Seeking warmer climates to ease the chill from having lost his throne, Charles settled along Austria's Mediterranean coast, now Slovenia, in October of 1835. But his journey ended in tragedy. Upon arriving in Gorizia, Slovenia, he caught cholera, succumbing to the disease on November 6, 1836. The townspeople, unlike his erstwhile French subjects, mourned him, draping their windows in black cloth. His body was laid to rest in the Franciscan Kostanjevica monastery, making him the only king of France buried outside his homeland. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factor Nate, for more incredible facts about everything.